World News Sunday. Here's Forrest Sawyer.
Good evening. Pressure is building tonight on Israel to accept a Middle East peace conference. Another Arab nation, Jordan, has signed on to the U.S.-backed plan. And Secretary of State James Baker, who today traveled from Saudi Arabia to Jordan, moved on to Jerusalem for some diplomatic arm twisting. As Barry Dunsmore reports, Israeli agreement still won't come easy.
Secretary Baker's first meeting with Prime Minister Shamir lasted only an hour and a half. It is to be resumed early tomorrow morning.
I can only describe the conversation as a whole as friendly and good.
This is Baker's toughest stop, convincing the Israelis to accept an American compromise on procedures for a Mideast peace conference. Baker was said to feel that the Israelis will ultimately say yes to the U.S. proposals, but then raise other, more difficult issues. One of those issues came up in Jordan today as King Hussein signed on to the Arab coalition.
We are ready to attend a peace conference, and we are very happy indeed that it is going to be a comprehensive one.
But Israel is likely to argue that neither Hussein nor the Syrians really will talk directly to Israel. Baker says they will.
The purpose of this conference would be to launch direct bilateral negotiations between Israel and Palestinians on the one hand, and Israel and her Arab neighbors on the other.
But the king would not flat out say yes to direct negotiations.
What do you attend the conference to do? Do you attend the conference to mime, to make faces at each other, or to discuss and try to resolve a problem?
Baker also met today with Palestinians from the occupied territories, and here too could be another problem if, as expected, the Israelis try to exercise a veto over the members of the Palestinian delegation. As the U.S. waited 6 weeks for a positive response from the Syrians, Baker will almost certainly give the Israelis sufficient time to consider. But sooner or later, the U.S. will want an answer, and Messrs. Bush and Baker will not want to hear that Israel thinks they have been wasting their time. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Even before Baker met Prime Minister Shamir, President Bush was urging Israel to come to the peace table. The president made the remarks in Turkey, where he is on a goodwill visit after Turkey supported the Gulf War. And while Mr. Bush is there to talk policy, he also traveled from the capital city of Ankara to Istanbul, where he played tourist. White House correspondent Britt Hume is with him.
The president called on some of Turkey's opposition leaders today and took the opportunity to say a few cautious words on his hopes for Mideast peace.
We put out a proposal that now is getting the kinds of support from various parties that I think the world has long awaited. So we'll just keep trying.
But what about Israel? What should it do? His answer repeated familiar U.S. policy against new Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. But coming now, it had new emphasis.
Well, we're asking that there be positive responses from all the parties. And our policy is well known on with Israel on settlements. We haven't changed one bit. And so there's some sticking points there.
Asked again what he specifically wanted from the Israelis, the president came back to the issue again.
I think anybody in the Middle East will tell you, and I hesitate to speak for my guest that I just met, but I haven't encountered anybody in this part of the world that thinks increasing settlements is a helpful thing.
That said, Mr. Bush spent the rest of the day in this fabled city where East meets West, receiving the grandest of tours with his friend Turkish President Özal. It was a rare day in the life of George Bush, who has been nearly everywhere in the world, but never before here, and seldom spends much time in the role of tourist. An afternoon sail on the historic Bosphorus waterway afforded Mr. Bush a spectacular view of this thriving city, which is making the most of his presence here. Sailing under one of the bridges that connects the European part of the city with its Asian section, the president could look up and see giant wind-blown banners bearing his face and that of his host spread against the sky. The president would not likely get that kind of reception in Israel tonight, and he knows that it will take more than a suspension of settlements by the Israelis to start anything that could really be called a peace process. But his experience with the Israelis seems to have convinced him that it's best to keep the expectations low and the pressure high. Britt Hume, ABC News,